in the Pacific region are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change, including in my country, Fiji. Countries like Fiji have not been major carbon emitters, yet we will be hard hit by climate change. More than 10 years ago, countries like Australia committed to providing $100 billion annually to support low-income countries to adapt to these growing impacts. This week at COP26, Australia committed to increase its contribution by $500 million to $2 billion over 5 years. Yet, the Overseas Development Institute has estimated Australia's fair share at about $4 billion annually. At the same time, Prime Minister Morrison refused to set a credible emission reduction target for 2030. Does Australia really expect Pacific leaders to be satisfied with these announcements?
Let's go to you, Kavita, if we can, particularly given you're there in Glasgow and you are a Pacific delegate there in Glasgow as well. What's your response?
Elizabeth is absolutely right. Australia is the pariah here right now because it has not enhanced its ambitions since 2015, and most countries are really stepping up to making sure that by 2030, so in the next decade, we see some real reductions in emissions. And Australia is not giving that at all. We're just playing with numbers here, like 25%, 35%. The fact is, it needs to do it by 75%. If there's any chance of us to keep this temperature to 1.5, we're just being thrown numbers and a 30-year timeline. In those 30 years, Pacific Islanders will be living on boats. So the reality is that much imminent for us in the Pacific, which is why the numbers don't add up. They don't align with the science. And Australia's just not stepping up. And nobody is buying Australia's bullshit anymore. Everyone can see that Australia is lying about a lot of its accounting trips and carbon capture and storage. Nobody's buying it anymore.
Adam Bandt?
Well, the COP that I went to that was hosted by Fiji, the Pacific Islanders were united in pleading with Australia not to open up new coal mines, the Adani coal mine. That was their number one ask. And cut pollution by 2030, more than you're doing at the moment, and don't open up new coal mines. Not only has Australia continued to open up new coal mines, with Liberal and Labor support, I might add, we are now on the verge of opening up a new massive gas bomb in the Northern Territory, the Beetaloo Basin. Like, everyone's heard about Adani. Like, Beetaloo is going to make Adani look like a fart in a bathtub. Like, it is massive. It will increase Australia's emissions alone by about 13%. We, at the time when everyone else is trying to phase it out, Labor and Liberal, coming back to Greg's point about subsidies, Labor and Liberal are taking public money that could be going to schools and hospitals and giving it to big corporations to open up new coal and gas mines in the time of climate crisis. This is criminal. We should be giving aid to countries in the Pacific because Australia and Australian corporations are responsible for some of the damage. And instead, we have this bipartisan agreement between Liberal and Labor to take public money and give it to big corporations who pay no tax and get them to fuel the climate crisis and make it worse. It is no wonder that our Pacific Island neighbours are looking to us and saying to our Australian Prime Minister, are you trying to kill us? Because that is what is happening. Homes are already being inundated and their whole countries and homes could be wiped out. And we are saying, Labor and Liberal are saying, we don't care, we'll open up more coal and gas.
Let me quote Fiji Prime Minister Bainimarama, who was actually speaking at the COP. Opening coal plants shuts the door on the future of low-lying Pacific nations. Whether you burn it yourself or export it to others, coal has no place in this century. What should be the proper response here, Matt Kean?
Well, I think we should be good friends to our neighbours. And if we want our neighbours to stand by us on the issues we care about, and let me just say this firstly, Virginia, we're seeing the Chinese Communist Party trying to expand their influence through the Pacific, through their Belt and Road initiative. Just like we want our Pacific friends and neighbours to be concerned about the issues that we're concerned about, so too should we be concerned about the issues that they're concerned about. And clearly climate change is an issue that they are very worried about, and we should be doing everything we can to be good neighbours and good friends to those nations in the Pacific.
Greg, Sheridan, I know that you're a big believer in our leadership role in the Pacific and have particular concerns, as Matt mentioned, many do, about Chinese expansion there as well. What should we be saying to our neighbours and how should we be behaving towards them when they do express this existential fear about their own existence?
Well, I agree that the Pacific should be an absolute top priority for Australian policy, an absolute top priority. I think we should be very generous financially. We have a different view about climate change, and of course it would be an irony if, because they were annoyed with us over climate change, they threw themselves into the arms of China.
But do we as Australia, do we really have a different view? We don't anymore, do we? Looking at them and saying, you're not being inundated because of climate change, it's something else.
No, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. No. What I meant was we have a different view about the consequence of Australian having a coal mining industry. For example, if a tonne of Chinese coal is displaced by a tonne of Australian coal, there are fewer greenhouse gas emissions as a consequence. So therefore...
It's just the drug dealers. Someone else will get it, get it from someone else.
The truth is...
The science is we need to keep it in the ground.
I'm glad the Greens believe in free speech for everyone who is a member of the Greens. For everyone who is a member of the Greens.
Yes, but you do have to let Greg finish his point though, Adam.
Yeah, and so we have a different view with of the South Pacific about the efficacy of our own actions and the consequences of them. But they ought to be our top national priority. We should always listen to them. I think Scott Morrison, in a sense, has been not bad with the Pacific. If we get into emissions trading, then we should buy all the emissions that the South Pacific sells. Nobody else should be in the market, and we should be their partner. But having said all that, that doesn't mean that because they think we ought not to have a coal industry, that we ought not to have a coal industry.
I just want to read to you something that came to us from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They mentioned or put out a media release today saying Australia is proud to join 2 declarations that called for urgent climate change action, which reaffirm climate change remains the single greatest threat to the peoples of the Pacific. So they've reaffirmed that. But as you say, the difference about whether to use or not use coal definitely remains. Blair?
Yeah, I think the onus is absolutely politically on us, not only to listen to the Pacific and to care about their concern about the impact that our emissions and the world's emissions are having on their very existence. But I think Greg makes an important point, which is they will begin to potentially look to partner with countries like China if Australia isn't in a position to listen to them, to act on the kind of action and be taken seriously and believably so to take on that. And what I have heard this week, unlike what Greg was referring to about Chinese briefings on climate, is that Xi Jinping sees this as his opportunity to play soft politics around the world to use the money and the influence they have to move into areas like Africa, Pacific, Southeast Asia and other countries.
As they've been doing for some time.
But more so with use climate as the lever to do so.
The way to do so.
By providing aid, assistance to transition into clean technologies.
Before we move on, I just quickly wanted to get a response. Maybe I'll go to you, Matt Kean, on this one. The Greenpeace report that came out just in the last few days that showed or claimed that Australia used bullying tactics in regional negotiations on climate change, that it tried to use its power and aid money to dilute the official communique from the Pacific Islands Forum in 2015, 16 and 19. How do you believe that's credible, first of all, and what should Australia's response to that be?
Well, no, I don't. Again, Australia should be leading the way when it comes to taking action on climate change because the cost of us not doing so is going to be enormous. Just ask the farmers in New South Wales who had to have their water trucked in because of the worst drought in living memory. Just ask the family that lost their house in the Black Summer bushfires on the south coast. Just ask the tourist operator on the Great Barrier Reef. There is a huge cost to our nation in not taking action on climate change. But let me just say, there is also a huge opportunity for our nation in taking action on climate change and leading the way. We know that the markets that take our coal are changing the type of resources they want from this country. We're really well placed to provide it. And there's a race on. And if we don't get at the front of that race, we're going to be left behind. And the opportunities to provide the world with green steel or green aluminium or green cement or green hydrogen are going to be filled by other capitalist nations that are going to enjoy the prosperity that we're about to miss out on. So this is not an environmental imperative alone. It's an economic one. So we should be moving because it's in our nation's economic interest to do so.